Get started again. Welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Kimberly Simpson and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded to public record for public record. Office hours recordings are on the California ESGCV past trainings webpage, and a copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to you. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and your question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide. Today's office hours agenda includes ESG resources, ESG CV updates, office hour updates, upcoming trainings, ESG CV Q&A, and our Spotlight series, fair market rent, and reasonable requirements. Next slide, please. And now some ESG updates, and I'll pass it to Tuesday.
Hello, good morning. Great news, the 2022 awards letters have been sent out, and they will be posted on our website by Friday. We plan on contracts being executed in July. The 2023 annual ESG NOFA should be released later this month. Webinars will be scheduled within 2 weeks of release. And an important reminder, 2021 contract expenditure deadlines are August 31st of 2023. It means you have to be like 112 days to get those, get your spending done. And now we're going to have Connie talk to you about fair market rents in California.
Okay, next slide, please. Good morning, everybody. We talked about this last week, showed this slide, and so I wanted to go through it again and just see if anybody who wasn't in attendance last week have attempted to submit a request to HUD for a waiver for the FMR. Again, this is just for the annual allocation, annual ESG, not CV. So HCD recognizes how difficult it is finding housing for our most vulnerable ESG clients because of the fair market rent restriction in our federal regs. We've learned through ESG CV that lifting the FMR restriction allows an ESG grantee to house those experiencing homelessness much quicker using the rent reasonableness to determine the appropriate rent for the area. So to keep this momentum going, HCD is considering submitting a request to HUD asking that they allow our state to waive the FMR restriction, but continue requiring the rent reasonableness, where with the comparison of rents, to determine the appropriate rent for each COC service area. So we would like to know, have any of you made this request or are in the process of submitting a similar request to HUD? If so, we want to know that we support this request. We would love to incorporate your request into our request because HCD wants to request the waiver for the entire state. If you have done this, we would like to meet with you to discuss what your proposal looked like, your process, your outcome and implementation. If you don't have an approval yet, HCD supports waivers of FMR, including state and entitlement funding. So we've already had one jurisdiction reach out to us, and we're meeting with them next week to just discuss this. So again, reach out to me. I will put my email address in the chat. If you're interested in visiting with us, we would really appreciate it. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Tuesday.
Yep. Okay, once again, we're going to point out that ESG has a website with a lot of really great resources and that include our policies and procedures, some checklists, and other important documents that will help your team meet HUD requirements. I really suggest going on and checking that out and finding some great resources. Next slide. And here is GT. Diane Prado, Giovanni Martinez, Anthony Zapita, and me, Tuesday Cool. Sarah Theobald is our program manager. You can always contact us at our email addresses, or you can go on to the ESG NOFA at hcd.ca.gov for questions, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tuesday. Thanks, Connie. And now for some ESG CV updates, reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and homeless prevention must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. And final requests for funds must be submitted to the department by November 15th, 2023. Next slide. Reminders while planning for ESG CV closeout, spend down timing, funding continuity, including HHAP funding flexibility, closing intake, projected dates for closing client intake for rental assistance, staffing issues, estimate declining caseloads for staff roles, workload, client issues involving and informing participants well before end of assistance. Next slide. Upcoming office hour topics, May 17th, Racial Equity Toolkit, May 24th, eligibility documentation for rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention, May 31st, income evaluation for rapid rehousing and homeless prevention, and June 4th, policy smorgasbord. And someone is going to drop the link into the chat for the training site to register, and also they'll drop the past link trainings. Next slide, please. Upcoming trainings for May 10th, from 12 to 1:30, data-driven decision-making community workshop. Next slide. Upcoming trainings for June 6th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Rent Reasonableness Policy Clinic, New and Non-Traditional Provider Series. And also for June 8th from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. HMIS Data Quality Program Management Session 1 Community Workshop. Next slide, please. And then June 22nd from 11 to 12:30, you have the HMIS Data Quality Management Session 2. Next slide, please. At this time, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat, and you may continue to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. Let me see if there are any questions. All right, there are no questions. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, please contact your annual ESG representative, or you can send an email to esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. And for ESGCV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. Now let's turn our attention to today's Spotlight Series, Fair Market Rent and Rent Reasonableness Requirements, Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing with Gordon and Shavana.
All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to, as Kim said, our Fair Market Rent and Rent Reasonableness presentation focusing on homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he, him. I'm white and Jewish, and I'm a homeless technical assistance provider with ICF. Shavana, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Shavana McCaleb. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a grant administrator.
All right, very good. Let's get underway. Next slide, please. Over to you, Shabana, to start us off.
Okay, fair market rent and rent reasonableness are housing affordability standards. Annual ESG can only provide rental assistance to a participant household if their housing unit meets both the following criteria. The unit's gross rent does not exceed the area fair market rent. The unit's gross rent is reasonable in comparison to rent for comparable unassisted units. ESG is required to meet rent reasonable standards, but not FMR standards. There's a waiver. ESG subrecipients must determine whether a unit meets rent reasonableness standards and, if applicable, fair market rent standards before the initial lease is signed, and periodically thereafter, more on recertifications later. Next slide, please. Fair market rent values are set annually by HUD. Every county and metropolitan service area has its own fair market rent. Fair market rent assessments are straightforward. For annual ESG, gross rent cannot exceed fair market rent. And again, for ESG CV, fair market rent does not apply because of the waiver. Next slide, please. Rent reasonableness. ESG recipients and subrecipients establish standards for rent reasonableness. Subrecipients determine whether a unit meets rent reasonableness. Rent reasonableness is calculated using local, comparable, unsubsidized units. It is not a fixed value and will differ between units. Rent reasonableness is more complex than fair market rent, but there are always ways to simplify it for recipients and subrecipient staff. Gross rent cannot exceed rent reasonableness standards established by the recipient and or subrecipient written policy. Next slide, please. Here we are going to compare the two, fair market rent and rent reasonableness. Who calculates whether a unit meets the standards? For both fair market rent and rent reasonableness, it is the subrecipient. Who establishes the point of comparison for standard? For fair market rent, it's HUD annually for each county and metropolitan service area. And then for rent reasonableness, recipient and the subrecipient written policy comparable units. Can gross rent exceed the applicable standard? For annual ESG, it cannot. For ESG CV, yes. And for both annual and ESG for rent reasonable, no. Next slide, please. Gordon, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. And I have to say, I think rent reasonableness policy is exciting. It's one of those areas where subrecipients and sub-subrecipients have a lot of influence and local authority to define what is true for them. That's not always true with federal grant programs. So this may seem like a pretty dry area of practice, but I think it's actually really rich for policy development. So excited about today's presentation. Let's talk about subrecipient requirements. Next slide, please. All right. So requirements by ESG component, street outreach and emergency shelter have no requirements at all. Anybody who is here just for those two, you can tune out for the rest of this presentation. Rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention are both required to do rent reasonableness and fair market rent when they're providing rental assistance. You'll notice that those are both marked up. It's because ESGCV does not require fair market rent. And as you heard, California is considering applying for a continuing waiver for FMR. Both annual ESG and ESGCV require rent reasonableness, and no one is looking for a waiver from rent reasonableness. That's going to continue going forward. When we're providing rental assistance, no, we've talked about this before. We're going to keep talking about it. It's an area of common confusion because it's an easy one to miss. A one-time rental arrears payment that does not include rental assistance, so forward-looking rental assistance. A one-time arrears payment without forward-looking assistance. does not require fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessment. It also doesn't require several other things that you would have to do with rental assistance. But for today's purpose, if you're just doing arrears, you don't have to do fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessments, regardless of whether we're talking ESG/CV or annual ESG. Next slide, please. So requirements for rapid and homelessness prevention. You're going to see that asterisk there, that star there, and it's going to keep saying that ESG/CV does not require fair market rent, where annual and ESG/CV do both require reasonableness. I'm going to stop saying it. It's going to be on slides. You're going to see it this entire presentation. What's required? It is required, rather, when you're providing rental assistance, when you're providing rental assistance and a one-time arrears payment, when you're providing rental assistance and housing relocation or stabilization services, and frankly, if you're providing rental assistance, arrears, and housing relocation or stabilization, if you're giving everybody everything. It's not required when you're providing a one-time rental arrears payment, or when you're providing relocation and stabilization, but no kind of rental assistance. However, if you then subsequently begin providing rental assistance, fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessments, if they are applicable, become required at that time, which means you can't like do 1 month of case management and then say, well, we don't have to do this since we've begun rental assistance a month later. You have to do fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessment at the time you begin providing rental assistance. Next slide, please. So your certification and recertification timing. For your initial certification, you have to do fair market rent and rent reasonableness before the initial lease is executed. The worst thing in the world as a monitor, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's up there, is finding a rent reasonableness and fair market rent assessment completed and dated after the lease. Because it's required in statute or in regulation, rather, that it has to be completed before the lease is executed, right? And this is one of those areas, we talk about this a lot, about areas that are liable for recapture versus areas that are more oriented around like correct going forward. This is one of those areas because it involves rental assistance, because there's very clear regulatory standards around this. This is one of those areas that can be a liability if you get it wrong. And so it's really important to make sure that your process flow at the subrecipient level is to complete fair market rent and reasonableness for initial lease generation before the lease is executed. For recertification, it has to happen before the renewal is executed. If an existing participant moves to a new unit, you have to do it before the new lease is executed, same as with the initial certification. You also have to do it when the project's written policy requires it. It is possible that your written policy may require you to do fair market rent reasonableness assessments more frequently than specified by renewal or anytime a participant moves. There aren't a lot of policies that are written that way, and I would sort of gently discourage it. There's not a lot of reason to be redoing those, but if your policy requires it, you have to follow your policy. There are other rent reasonableness assessment triggers. They're pretty unusual. They're in the slide notes. You can look them up after the slideshow. But if you're doing it, if you're orienting your flow around before the lease is executed, anytime you renew a lease and before a new lease is executed, you've got like 99% of your situations covered. Next slide, please. Back over to you, Shavana.
Thank you, Gordon. Calculating fair market rent. Next slide, please. Gross rent. So here you will see in our half glass, we have everything that is the total, makes up the total rent. So we have occupancy fees. Those are fees required by, that are required under the lease, excluding late fees and pet fees. And then you have your contract rent. This is the amount of rent owed by the tenant to the owner in the lease. And then we have your utility allowance. Your utility allowance is the monthly utility allowance established by your local public housing authority, so by your PHA. So when calculating gross rent, only include the utility allowance amount for those utilities that the participant pays for separately. And I will give you two examples. So let's say we have client Alex, and his water and sewer costs are included in the contract rent amount. The utility allowance amounts for water and sewer would not be included in Alex's gross rent calculation. Now we have client B, Reed, is responsible for paying their own electricity bill. The utility allowance amount for electricity would be included in Reed's gross rent calculation. Utility allowance does not include telephone, cable, satellite television service, and or internet service. If all utilities are included in the contract rents, there is no utility allowance to include in the gross rent calculation. It's also important to note that some housing units are covered by more than one public housing authority. In those cases, subrecipients may choose which utility allowance schedule they apply. However, whichever choice you make must be consistently across your project. Next slide, please. Here, we are giving you another example. So you have your contract rent amount, that is $1,500, plus your occupancy fees. The landlord has put $50 worth of fees in the lease. Then you have your utility allowance, what the tenant is going to pay, $237. So it equals $1,787 for the gross rent. Now, so when you go to do your fair market rent, you know that it has to be less than or equal to that $1,787. In this case, it is, which means the unit meets fair market rate standards. Turn it back over to you, Gordon. Oh.
All right, thank you. Yeah, questions coming in the chat. Great, keep them coming. We'll look at them during the Q&A portion at the end of this presentation, which is rapidly approaching. Next slide, please. So here's a key concept around reasonability. And if you pay attention to like nothing else either of us have said this entire session, this is the slide that we really want you to pay attention to. We said earlier, Shavana said earlier, that fair market rent is simple, rent reasonableness is complicated, which is true. Fair market rent's real easy. You just look up the number, and if the rent plus utility allowances below the fair market rent value, you're good to go. Rent reasonableness is a lot more squishy, which is why it's such an interesting area of policy. The regulatory requirement is that gross rent for participant units must be reasonable in relation to other comparable unassisted units in the area. The reason that I'm saying reasonable and comparable is because those terms are either ill-defined or not defined at all in regulation. Reasonable has to take into consideration at minimum unit location, quality, size, type, age, amenities, and maintenance and utilities provided by the owner. Those aren't all the things that it has to take into consideration. That's just like that's table stakes, right? That's what you need to do. You can consider other things beyond that. Subrecipients, which in this case means whoever is doing the rent reasonableness calculation, which in the COC world we would say projects. Subrecipients determine what reasonable means in their written standards. There are many ways to assess and arrive at reasonable. This is generally defined. There's a level of definition that occurs at HCD's reasonable, HCD's written standards level, but most of it is passed down to subrecipients to define what is reasonable for their COC. And indeed, subrecipients can pass it down to their subrecipients to make further definitions. And always be more restrictive or specific, but you can never be less restrictive and less specific than whoever is up the chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so key concept, this is sort of the companion slide to the last one. You've got to have a written rent reasonableness policy. And please hear me when I say written, not like you've got somebody who does rent reasonableness and it lives in their head and they've got like a process that they follow. And so when HUD comes to monitor or HCD comes to monitor, your answer to what is your rent reasonableness policy is talk to Steve. That's not a good policy. You need to put it in writing. You need a written rent reasonableness policy, and then you have to follow the rent reasonableness policy, which should, at minimum, describe how comparable units are identified, list the qualities that are assessed for comparability that have to include the things on the previous slide, but may include other things. It's complicated to talk about what other things are, but they locally defined other qualities that you think are important and help determine whether a unit makes sense in relation to other units. They have to establish documentation standards. So like, what's the paper trail that you generate as part of rent reasonableness? What do you, when you have comparable units, what do you have to provide in terms of documenting what their qualities are, so on and so on. You have to define what makes rent reasonable. And this is the part that everybody gets wrong. There is a misconception that rent reasonableness means taking 2 or 3 comparable units, averaging their rent and utility allowances, and then if your participant's unit is equal to or less than the average, then that's what reasonableness is. And that's not what rent reasonableness is. That is a way to do rent reasonableness. It's a common way. It's a sensible way in a lot of, from a lot of perspectives, it's a very sensible way. Because it's easy to understand, because there's a HUD template out there that handles it for you. And so there are COCs, there are ESG subrecipients who would look at that and say, yeah, sounds good, let's go with that. But there are other ways to set it up. Rent reasonableness can be complex and flexible and reflect your local realities. And so one of the ways that it can be complex and flexible, especially in an area where affordable housing is limited, like let's say California, is if you're saying like, okay, we're going to take our comparable units and we're going to find their average of their total rent, which is actual rent plus gross rent plus utilities. Okay, we'll get that number, but we're going to compare that to our participant unit, and we're not going to see if the participant unit rent is below the average. We're going to say it's reasonable if it's below the average plus $50 or $100 or within 10%. All of those are different ways that you can set up rent reasonableness. It doesn't even have to be an average of 3 comparables. It could be a median, it could be 2 comparables, it could be 5 comparables. It could be within $50 of the lowest comparable, it could be $50 within the highest comparable. All of these things can be established in your policies and procedures. As long as you've got it in writing, the question that HUD will ask isn't, did you look at 3 comparables and take the average and look at what is, is it equal to or less than the comparables average? The question is, okay, do you have a policy and did you follow that policy? Now there's a lot of rope there, right? You got a lot of line. And your policy can't get too ridiculous. I was giving an example earlier, somebody had asked about this. And I said, it doesn't have to, it's not in statute that it's like within 50 over. It's whatever you define. You could in theory have a policy that says like, as long as it's within $500 of the average. I feel like $500 is really taking an inch and is really getting an inch and taking a mile. There's an extent to which it has to pass the sniff test, right? This has to make some kind of sense. But as long as your policy is sensical and you feel comfortable defending it if someone were to question it, and you've got good reasons for what you're doing, your policy has a lot of flexibility. There is more info on the HUD Exchange. That's just one document. If you look up rent reasonableness and FMR on HUDX, there's tons and tons and tons of resources available. And as always, if you are interested in alternative rent reasonableness setups, ask your fellow COCs. There are COCs out there doing weird and interesting things inside and outside of California to make rent reasonableness work for them. Ask your partner COCs, they're going to be your best resource. Next slide. So just an example of assessing rent reasonableness. And I'm not going to walk through this in quite the excruciating detail that it is laid out, but this is one way to do it. Where if the policy is that all units have to have the same number of bedrooms and be in the same census tract, and participant gross rent has to be less than or equal to the gross rent for each comparable, this setup would meet rent reasonableness because all of the units are in the census tract. all of them are 1 bedroom, and the participant's gross rent is less than or equal to the gross rent of each of the comparables. Staff should sign and date the form they use, and of course, the date should be before or on the date of leasing. But other than that, that's the way it should roll. Next slide, please. Which I think brings us into, I think we're labeling it discussion now, but really it's your opportunity to highlight what you want to know, ask questions, talk with us and each other, and otherwise just dive into this topic. So do we have some questions?
We do, Gordon. We have quite a few
Ooh, I love quite a few.
in the chat.
Okay.
And the first one is, would examples of occupancy fees be admin fees, added non-optional trash valet fees, parking permit fees, etc.?
Interesting. So I'm going to defer the fees question. Fees are tricky, and I'm honestly, I would have a really good answer for you on the COC side. And on the ESG side, especially with ESG CV still floating out there, I'm inclined to not touch that question and instead suggest that you submit it in writing to your grant administrator, or, and this is always an option, submit it in writing to the HUD Ask a Question desk on the HUD Exchange under ESG, and they can give you a definitive answer. If you get it to your GA, you'll get an answer as well, but it'll come locally instead of from HUD, unless Shavana or anyone else on the phone from our side feels like they've got a really good grip on this one and wants to answer occupancy fees. Not a lot of enthusiasm for.
I'm going to stick with your answer, Gordon, and allow them to submit it to either the GA or to the HUD AAQ.
I think that's the way. Not because it's particularly complicated, but because it's a little twisty and we want to make sure we give you good info. Cool question. Shavana, I've got another one that I want to toss over to you. And I'm curious what you have to say about it. So we've got a question in the chat. How do you determine utility allowance for comparable units? And how do you know what is included in utility allowance? What's your take on that?
So for utility allowance for the comparable units, again, you're going to use your public housing authority form to determine the utility allowance even for comparable that is in that area. And the second half, how do you know what is included? For usually when you're looking at comparable units, they will tell you that's one of the things that you have to put on there. Water and sewer is included. However, the tenant is responsible for electric, gas, and so on.
Absolutely right. So would you mind if I ask you a follow-up question? Because I think it's a good one, and I'm not sure whether anyone here is stuck with this one, but I'm curious what others think about this one. So Shavana, what if the unit happens to fall in a jurisdiction that is covered by 2 public housing authorities?
By 2 public housing authorities, again, it is going to be up to the subrecipient and the recipient to choose the one and then stay consistent in the one in which they choose for that area.
Absolutely, completely correct. And the only thing that I would add to that perfect answer is that it ought to be in your written policies and procedures. So go ahead and pick in writing. The only situation in California that I can see this coming up in, because you don't have a statewide housing authority, is if you're in a city that has a public housing authority that covers it and a county public housing authority, they're not a shared government, and the unit is in the city, and so in theory you could be covered by either the city or the county, in which case you would use whichever is in your policies. Tuesday, yeah, when you're looking at what's included or not for a comparable. It's the same as with participant unit. It's in the listing on Craigslist or in the paper or wherever you're getting listings these days. It was Craigslist back when I was doing this, and that kind of dates me a little bit, which I think I'm comfortable with. Yeah, Shavana, other questions you want to toss at me?
Gordon, I think that's all I see in the chat that has come through so far. Please feel free to either unmute yourself or to put your question in the chat for us.
We do have one that was a little further up, Shavana. It was from Eleanor Vega. And they asked, under who calculates rent reasonableness slide, it states that the subrecipient does. This is not calculated by the sub or the provider of services.
Yep. So I have to. So I'm going to be honest with y'all. This was this slideshow was adapted from a presentation that we did very early on when Mike Thomas and I started working on this contract. And so we had not yet sussed out the correct way to articulate the difference between a subrecipient, a sub-subrecipient, a project sponsor, and all of the different ways that we talk about the way HCD's ESG program is layered. And so just to put a real fine point on it, whoever is responsible for providing housing assistance is the organization that is supposed to be doing the rent reasonableness and fair market rent calculation. They're responsible for it. In theory, they can subcontract it out, right? You can, I mean, there's no reason why as a rapid provider, you couldn't have a subcontractor whose only job is doing fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessments. I would have trouble saying yes to that subcontract. It doesn't sound like that much fun. But generally speaking, the rental assistance provider, the organization providing the rental assistance, is responsible for ensuring that fair market rent and rent reasonableness are conducted and are accurate before the lease is signed.
Gordon, I am going to toss one more at you that I did see came in.
Yeah.
It was, do we have to do fair market rent and rent reasonable when housing clients in low income units? And what about tax credit units?
I love this question. This is such a good question because tax credit units are such an important resource. And we get this is actually a very common question. The answer is yes, you do. You do have to do fair market rent and rent reasonableness on whatever unit you're putting a participant into under ESG. There are no exceptions to that unless we're talking about like ESG CV having waived fair market rent. The advantage is that when you're putting someone into a unit that is restricted for low-income households or that are tax credit properties, you can be confident that they will meet whatever standard you put in place. It would be very unlikely for them not to meet fair market rent reasonableness. What else? I'm looking to see if we missed anything, but I think that's all of it. I think that's everything. Yeah, other questions? We would invite you off. We've got time. Happy to issue a time refund. But if you have questions about fair market rent and rent reasonableness, now's a good time to ask them. I might be the only person on the planet who genuinely loves rent reasonableness, and so you've got a really receptive audience for your questions. All right, well, I think that's it. Everybody has decided they are done with rent reasonableness and fair market rent for the morning. So Kim, I'll toss it back to you. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Gordon and Shavana. Thank you all for your questions. As usual, a quick survey will launch as you exit the session. Please take a minute to reply, as we are always striving to provide useful content and needed technical assistance and training. Have a great day, everyone.